What is going on, everybody? James Hancock here. I'm back with a spoiler-free review for The First Omen, which goes into wide release this weekend. It is technically the sixth movie in the Omen franchise, although it's a direct prequel to The Omen from 1976, a movie which I include in the Hall of Fame of all-time great horror films. And if you want to know, I guess, the extent of my love and affection for that movie, check out Wrong Reel 666, which I'll include down in the description below. That was actually the very last pure audio podcast that I ever did for Wrong Reel, and I think it was an absolute banger. And I'm not using the expression lightly when I say that it belongs in the Hall of Fame of all-time great horror movies. Like, that list would obviously include movies like The Texas Chainsaw Massacre or The Exorcist or Rosemary's Baby. A lot of movies from the late 60s and 70s. Night of the Living Dead. It was just a really juicy, rich period for really kick-ass horror films. But what makes The Omen so special, unlike Rosemary's Baby, unlike The Exorcist, The Omen was an original screenplay. It's one of those rare things where somebody just came up with an idea, wrote it down, and they made it into a movie. And it helps if you've got Richard Donner in the director's chair as opposed to Arkasha Stevenson, who comes from the world of TV, but I believe this is their feature film debut with The First Omen. But when talking about the original film from 1976, it's easy to call attention to the iconic score by Jerry Goldsmith or the impeccable direction by Richard Donner, who was right on the cusp of doing things like Superman and Lethal Weapon. I mean, he was at the beginning of a legendary career. And then, of course, you have all these incredible performances by people like David Warner or Lee Remick or Gregory Peck. But if you set all that aside, like, for the longest time, I thought The Omen was based on a best-selling novel. It's got the depth and the complexity and kind of the richness of material where I just assumed there must be some great 700-page tome out there that they use as the inspiration for The Omen. But no, it was just an original screenplay. And when you're making a movie in the franchise or with the same name as a movie as good as that first one was, well, then naturally you're going to set up unrealistic expectations. Like, a lot of people were saying this about Roadhouse last week. And like, if you didn't call it Roadhouse and just called it something else and just let it be kind of an MMA adjacent action movie, people probably would have been a little more kind to it. But the moment you call a movie The First Omen, well, then I think you're setting yourself up for trouble. But much to my surprise, for like the first 2/3 of this movie, it wasn't bad, it wasn't great. It was a movie that was always on the verge of becoming a pretty good horror movie, and I was enjoying it. I was enjoying the performance by the lead actress, whose name is escaping me. She played Marcella Baratheon in Game of Thrones, but her name is Nell Tiger Free. But she's incredible. She absolutely was invested in the role. But where this movie really gets into trouble is when it tries to be a direct prequel right into The Omen from 1976. Because I feel like most of the horror audience is like people in their teenage years or their 20-something years. I don't know how many of them are watching 50-year-old horror movies. I mean, maybe I should give them more credit or give them the benefit of the doubt that they'd be curious about a movie like the same way, like in the 1980s, I was curious about Universal horror movies from the 1930s. There are always going to be those fanatics who want to watch the horror classics. But this movie, you can see it tying itself in knots, trying to make like basically all the trains run on time so that it can feed directly into the original film. I was like, oh my God, why don't y'all just make your own, Antichrist movie or your own Antichrist franchise? And that way you could have just let the finale or the climax be whatever you wanted it to be, as opposed to kind of like backing yourself into a corner. But they back themselves into a corner with all these additional plot wrinkles where you're like, ugh. Well, now you can't be a direct sequel because none of the following films about Damien, 1, 2, and 3, are going to make any fucking sense now that you've introduced these additional wrinkles. It's just a weird problem, and I'm rooting for the movie to do well enough where the filmmakers and the actors can all move on to bigger and better things. But I'm genuinely, sincerely hoping that this movie makes just shy of the requisite amount of money that it would need to justify a sequel, because I think it's only going to go further downhill from here. So what can we talk about without giving anything away? Let's start with the cast and crew. According to Wikipedia, The First Omen is an American supernatural horror film directed by Arkasha Stevenson, who co-wrote the screenplay with Tim Smith and Keith Thomas from a story by Ben Jacoby. It is a prequel to The Omen, 1976. Being the sixth film in the Omen franchise, the film stars Nell Tiger Free, Tawfiq Baram, or Sonia Braga, Ralph Ineson, and Bill Nye. Ralph Ineson and Bill Nye are okay, but it's very rare for an actor to really like transcend subpar material. I'd say the material they're given, it's fine, it's perfectly adequate. And if this movie didn't completely just fall apart at the seams in the final third, then probably everybody would have their heads held high as a result of this movie. But I don't want to get too sidetracked with my disappointment with the ending, because there are a few little bits and pieces, a few little ingredients along the way that actually did. I kept trying to talk myself into liking it along the way, because I did genuinely, sincerely want to see a really good horror movie. So let's focus on the positive first. So when I walked into the Alamo Drafthouse in Lower Manhattan, I immediately was in a good mood, because they had a confession booth set up in the lobby with a mannequin where you could sit and confess your sins and that sort of thing. And I told the people in the theater, well, I needed to go off and do some bad deeds before I could come back and make a full unbridled confession. And of course, because this was the Alamo Drafthouse, they had this incredible lineup of trailers and shorts and that sort of thing before the movie started, just to kind of get us in the mood. So I walk into the theater and they're showing the trailer for Damien Omen 2, which I think was actually the first Omen movie that I ever saw, when Damien's at military school and discovers the numbers and freaks out and blah, blah, blah. And Omen 3, The Final Conflict, my older brother was obsessed with it back in the day. I would catch it in bits and pieces, but it was too early for me to get that deep into the Omen franchise. It wasn't really until college that I got totally obsessed with the original Omen from 1976. In any case, if you want to get me in the good mood before whatever movie's about to start, well, the Alamo Drafthouse knows exactly how to set the proper tone. But I must admit that I never saw Omen 4, The Awakening from 1991, where they kind of rebooted it or started it over with some new characters. And I never saw the 2006 remake by John Moore. I just couldn't bring myself to do it. And I don't really know why I brought myself to see the first Omen, apart from the fact I allowed the trailer to kind of get its hooks into me and to persuade me and seduce me and to convince me that it actually was going to be a horror movie worth seeing. And also, David Goyer is one of the producers. David Goyer, both as a comic book writer and as a movie writer, he's written some good stuff. He worked with Nolan on Batman Begins and things like that. So I went into this movie with the best of it, I guess not the loftiest of expectations, but I went in good faith. I was not rooting against the movie in any way, shape, or form. But what's kind of unintentionally hilarious about the first half of this movie, it's like a side-by-side remake with Immaculate, which just came out a couple weeks ago. I mean, I don't know how both these movies decided to come out at more or less the same time. It's been a long time since we've had any nunsploitation movies apart from Benedetta by Paul Verhoeven, but suddenly we're getting back-to-back nunsploitation movies where in both movies, both Immaculate as well as in the First Omen, you have an American nun going over to Italy and trying to adjust, in one case to a new convent, here to an orphanage. Or actually, is it more of an yeah, it's an orphanage. It's an orphanage, but also a place where unwed mothers can have their babies and that sort of thing. But you have an American who rapidly comes to realize that not all is as it seems. There's something rotten in Denmark. It's there's some dirty work afoot, and they start to investigate. And for people who know the first film well, I guess you'll immediately know something's up when the character Father Brennan shows up, in this case played by Ralph Ineson, originally played by Patrick Troughton. He's got an Irish name. When it comes to pronunciation of Irish names, I historically get all tongue twisted and all tongue tied. In any case, Father Brennan, when he shows up, is oh shit! They quite literally are starting to lay down the tracks and push the train in a very specific direction. And I just realized I haven't even really mentioned the official plot, because I just assumed, because I grew up with the Omen franchise, that everybody knows what the Omen is about. But it's basically about the birth of the Antichrist and bringing the world to its knees, or perhaps bringing it to its knees, the apocalypse, all that stuff. But throughout the 1980s and throughout the 1990s, anytime you met a freaky kid who kind of sat in the corner who seemed a little strange or a little weird, he became Damien. That's when you know a movie's really crossing over into kind of mainstream pop culture, when even people who have not seen The Omen know what you mean when you describe somebody as Damien. And maybe it was mean, but it was the 1980s. It was a barbaric time, and we didn't care. We called kids Damien. First Omen, the main character, Margaret, played by Nell Tiger, she rapidly starts to realize there's some strange stuff going on when she witnesses a birth. And during that birth, she can't quite tell if she's partially hallucinating, because she used to hallucinate as a child, or if she's actually seeing what she really thinks she's seeing. And I'm not going to allude to what she sees, but here's a bit of news that I read over on Wikipedia. According to this post, they say, a specific shot in the birthing sequence resulted in the Motion Picture Association registering the film with an NC-17 rating classification. Producer Keith Levine said, we had to go back and forth with the ratings board 5 times. Weirdly, avoiding the NC-17 made it more intense. And I actually totally agree about the intensity of that scene, because of the way that it's shot, because of the way that it's been censored and edited. you're never quite sure if you're seeing what you think you're seeing. Like little things are implied because you're watching a pretty horrific birthing sequence where like you don't want to see, but you're kind of like, all right, I guess I want to see the traffic accident as the car goes by. But they're removing all the shots that probably would have had everybody like barfing in the aisles and that sort of thing. And when I say birthing sequence, that's only the tip of the iceberg. There's a lot more going on in this particular scene. But the movie does have legit horror sequences that are going to make people squirm, make people squeamish, that sort of thing. On the other hand, the movie also resorts to a very gimmicky bag of tricks, namely jump scares, where you can see the tease or the setup coming or the misdirect coming where, jump scares are the easiest thing in the world to do, where you're like, you snap over here, make the audience look, and then something goes, oh! And it's so boring and so predictable, and nothing makes me immediately think a filmmaker is full of shit or a hack or untalented faster than seeing them resort to too many jump scares in a horror film. If you want to whip out one or two for extra impact, I'll forgive you. But they got to be really, really fucking good where they just make your heart fucking stop. But when a movie starts overly relying upon it means they don't know how to create the atmosphere and the tension and the dread and the emotions that a really good horror movie can generate in the viewer. And then there's some scenes that are very deliberate and obvious callbacks to the film from 1976, where once again you're setting yourself up for the fall because the original film has 2 or 3 scenes where you're like, oh my Lord. And if you've seen the film, you know precisely which scenes that I'm talking about, but nothing makes your movie feel, more thin than when you're doing kind of a half-assed version of a scene that's already worked really well 50 fucking years ago. And also, in the context of this movie, this is a mild spoiler, but this is only a mild spoiler if you've seen the original film from 1976, but the scene where the person says, "It's all for you." They recreate that scene here, but it doesn't even make sense because in the context of the original film, when that person does what they do, it's under the influence of some demonic Rottweilers and that sort of thing. That's another thing. The original movie, it gets so much mileage out of just close-ups of dogs with creepy music, no special effects are needed. All you need is a pretty dog or a good-looking dog and some spooky music and you're off to the races. But in the context of the original scene or the original movie, when they had that scene, it's because they're making room for somebody that's going to be basically like a guide and a protector looking out for Damien. So they need to get the original nanny out of the way so that Damien's helper can take that slot. But here the scene just happens and the consequences don't even really make any sense. And it leads to a few kind of spooky spiritual aftershocks. But it's you could just tell an executive said, people love that scene in the original, so you better find a way to just kind of shoehorn it into your movie, even if it doesn't make any sense, and add a little extra bit of flavoring so it seems a little more intense on the surface. But in the absence of the emotions of the original scene, it just feels like, I hate to use the term member berries because I feel like that term is overused. Anytime people start overusing a particular idea or a particular term, it immediately gets sapped of any real ability to communicate anything. So let's just use the phrase callback. But when you use callbacks to a classic movie, whether you're talking about Ghostbusters Frozen Empire doing callbacks to the 1984 original, or the First Omen doing callbacks to the original from 1976, it's almost like they're expecting the audience to be like, oh, that's something I recognize, therefore I'm having a good time. It reminds me of Terminator Genesis, which came out 10 years ago, when they're doing the scenes from the original Terminator from 1984. They were recreating them. It was oh, that's something I recognize, therefore it's good. No, therefore the movie is hollow. Therefore the movie is superficial. Therefore everything's on the surface. There's no depth. There's no meaning. It's basically nostalgia taken to an almost pornographic extreme, which makes these movies feel like empty vessels. And when you're talking about great horror movies from the 1970s, no one would describe them as empty vessels, but Ghostbusters The Frozen Empire was an empty vessel. This movie is more or less an empty vessel. And whenever you have a movie that's a reboot or a franchise extension and you're comparing it unfavorably to the original, inevitably there's always that camp that's dude, Ghostbusters was never really that good, or Roadhouse was never really that good, or The Omen was never really that good, or Star Wars wasn't even that good back in 1977. It's all these people need to go back to the kids' table until they've seen enough flicks and read enough books and undergone enough aesthetic enrichment and kind of enrich their palette to the point where they can actually tell the difference between an authentic work of art, an authentic piece of storytelling versus what is just a transparent cash grab trying to resurrect a dead franchise. Which is a shame because there are some scenes early on that I liked. At one point, the the main character, when she meets her roommate's like, well, before we take our vows and, before we give like our chastity and our devotion and our emotion to God, blah, 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 we ought to go out and dance with some boys just so we know or appreciate what we're giving up. And this club scene is good fun. And obviously the lead actress is very easy on the eyes, and she has a wild night on the town in Italy. And it's a really cool, stylish, like exhilarating scene, which almost kind of ventures into Rosemary's Baby territory as opposed to The Omen. But it's hard to get to The Omen unless you have Rosemary's Baby first, because obviously Rosemary's Baby is about creating the baby that will become the Antichrist, whereas The Omen, which is unrelated to Ira Levin's novel, but you could almost kind of put the two together. But obviously The Omen picks up with the birth of the Antichrist. But I do want to place special emphasis on this. Nell Tiger is really good in this. She surpasses the material. She's better than the material. You can tell she's doing everything in her power to make this material soar. She has one scene where you can tell like she's almost doing like Isabelle Adjani's routine from Possession. Like she's going for it. She's going all out. And it's just a shame that the material and the movie are not quite on that level. I think this movie, even if it doesn't necessarily connect with a wider audience, at a minimum, it'll be a great showcase of her talents moving forward. But sadly, as good as she is, there are one or two scenes where, in spite of her best efforts to kind of save the scene, they've come across as unintentionally comedic or unintentionally humorous. Like, I think there are going to be some interesting memes that come out of this movie. There's one particular scene where somebody's trying to do something affectionate and sweet, and you get a bit of gore, and like, anyway, it's meant to be shocking and horrifying, but I just kind of rolled my eyes like, all right, this is getting officially ridiculous. And it's a shame because I was genuinely hoping for another kick-ass horror experience. Like, we've had a lot of horror movies this year. I haven't even kept up with all of them. I missed Imaginary. I feel like between Imaginary and If, aka Imaginary Friend, there are too many Imaginary Friend movies coming out at the same time. But we already had Late Night with the Devil, which is my favorite horror film of the year so far. I thought that was fantastic. Obviously, we had Immaculate, which I really enjoyed, but a lot of people seem to be thumbs down on. But whatever, it seems to be making a tidy little profit. So Immaculate, I think everybody involved with Immaculate can, hold their head high. But I think if this movie is going to have any chance of finding an audience, I'm skeptical. But if it finds an audience, it's going to be a younger audience that's not attached to the original film. And it just seems like such a strange, fruitless endeavor trying so hard to set up a movie that came out 50 years ago. And it's just, I guess the simple answer is stop remaking and or making prequels to or sequels to horror classics. Take inspiration from them, see what they did, and follow their example. Like Rosemary's Baby, adaptation of a best-selling novel. The Exorcist, adaptation of a best-selling novel. Night of the Living Dead basically invented its own genre. The Omen, great original screenplay, like the really good horror movies from the 1970s. Or the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, where a bunch of maniacs got together in like 120-degree weather, like the most miserable conditions imaginable, went out into the country and made one of the most iconic movies ever made. I don't even say that Texas Chainsaw Massacre, you have to kind of categorize it as a horror film. It's just one of the best movies that I've seen. That movie is unimaginably powerful, and just, it was a great era for the genre. And you did actually have a few remakes at that time, like Last House on the Left by Wes Craven was technically a remake of Ingmar Bergman's The Virgin Spring. So even the 70s were not immune to the remake phenomenon, but The Last House on the Left, it was so terrifying and so shocking and so perverse and so fucked up that I feel like, I don't know if people walked out of thinking, oh, like, what does Ingmar Bergman think, blah, blah, blah. It basically became its own thing. And that's always my recommendation for horror storytellers or horror enthusiasts. Make up your own characters, make up your own stories. The budgets are low and the audience is reliable. There are people who will see every single goddamn scary movie that comes out. So they've got patience, and they're broad-minded, and they are very open to and very accepting of new franchises. Like, look at them, Triple X followed by Pearl, which is leading into Maxine. That's a brand new horror franchise. People are fired up. Like, bring on the original stories to take their inspiration from and take their cues from the greats of the past, but let the past be the past. Let the classics remain where they are, but take the baton from the John Carpenters of the world and the Tobe Hoopers of the world and the William Friedkins and the George Romeros and all those legends and David Cronenberg, all those giants from that period. Take the baton from their hand and run with it and tell your own stories your own ways. So I do not recommend people hunt down The First Omen, at least this weekend. If you're thinking about flicks to see, I'm assuming that Monkey Man, which I'm seeing tomorrow, is going to be vastly superior, but I will be back in y'all's face later on tomorrow evening after I've seen The Monkey Man for myself. In any case, hope you enjoyed this video to some degree. I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news. I feel like I've been doing a lot of bad or kind of negative reviews as of late, but maybe that trend will be reversed tomorrow after I see Monkey Man. But thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. Remember to like, hit the bell, subscribe, all that good stuff. But I hope everybody has a great weekend at the movies. But more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.